Thank you. Thank you very kindly. Am I turned on? That probably isn't the best way to put it. Or, yeah, I mean, you can hear me. That's got to watch your words sometimes. I was just flying back last week from Southern Virginia. I'd given a talk down there, and I sat on the airplane next to a young lady who was grading papers. And if somebody's going to sit next to me and have things right out on the table, I can't help but kind of, look over and see. And every time she brought up another paper, they were clearly students' papers. I gathered she was a teacher, and I was right. I would see this expression, the Reverend Brown, the Reverend Brown, the Reverend Brown. And the next paper, the Reverend Brown, Reverend Brown. And I thought, oh, don't tell me. She is grading papers on essays written on the Scopes Trail, and every student has seen fit to largely focus on the Reverend Jeremiah Brown from the movie or play Inherit the Wind. And I asked her, and she said, yes, as a matter of fact, that's what she was doing. I asked her if she was aware of the number of discrepancies, which are almost everywhere, between Inherit the Wind and the actual events of the Scopes Trail, and she claimed to be aware of that. Everything I would bring up, she would say, yes, she knew that. I was tempted to bring up something that wasn't true and hear her tell me, yes, she knew that too. But they were covering this, spending the better part of a week in an English class, looking at the movie Inherit the Wind and then having the students write on it, and the students appear to have been very much influenced by one scene, which I will show you, involving the Reverend Jeremiah Brown, who, by the way, doesn't exist. When I got home, I had a phone call waiting for me. It was a physician in Kansas City, Missouri. It appears that the teachers in Kansas City, Missouri, are showing a movie, Inherit the Wind. This time, I believe it was in a social studies class, and some of the parents were concerned that it gave a misrepresentation of the events of the Scopes Trail, and what was even worse, it demeaned the character of Christians in general and people who believe in the Creator in particular. And they wanted me to call into a radio station where they were discussing this, and the screener at the radio station said they were not the slightest concerned over whether Inherit the Wind was historically accurate or not. That was not an issue. They were going to be showing it in the school anyway. The point is, you're going to be hearing a lot about Inherit the Wind. It's been declared to be a great classic, and it is being shown and discussed in English class, in social studies class, and in various science classes. Let's just take a look at it. You know, you kind of expect Hollywood to get things mixed up. But this play and movie and the various television versions of it do more than get the story of Inherit the Wind or the story of the Scopes Trail mixed up. They literally turn on end essentially all of the statements of events that happened in that great legal event. What you see here is the play Inherit the Wind that was written and produced for the first time in 1955. In the center, you see the first version of the movie involving Spencer Tracy and Frederick March and Gene Kelly. That came out in 1960. It's a black and white film, though I gather it's been colorized in recent years. And then Jack Lemmon and George C. Scott did a more recent version of it in 1999. And there are at least 3 or 4 different made-for-television versions of this. So you might encounter it in many different environments. People try to defend this, even if they concede that it's historically inaccurate, by arguing that it is a great classic piece of theater, which students need to understand, and that's why they bring it into the English class. But you know, we don't show every classic movie that's out there. For example, some of the movies could be considered propaganda. If you look in the Encyclopedia Britannica on the article propaganda, you'll see there it's defined in this way. Propaganda is the making of deliberately one-sided statements to a mass audience. It is an act of advocacy in mass communication. In order to reach a mass audience, propagandists rely on every medium of communication, including, of course, theater, Propaganda differs from legitimate advocacy in that it editorializes, gives a highly biased view, or is lacking in authenticity. And I believe all of those apply to the movie Inherit the Wind. Now, there are other classics, in fact, much bigger classics than Inherit the Wind. One of the great classics of all time, as far as theater is concerned, is The Birth of a Nation. We do not show this movie, and understandably so, in the classrooms of America today. The movie deals with Reconstruction after the Civil War. Blacks jump on some poor young white girl and rape her, and this man forms the Ku Klux Klan and extracts vengeance on the blacks. And it's an extremely racist movie, but historically a very important one, truly a classic. We don't show this because there would be a great outcry. This is demeaning to a group of people. And nowadays we're trying to avoid that in our schools. And I think for this very reason we ought to avoid Inherit the Wind. Let's just take a look at this film. By the way, Woodrow Wilson really liked this particular film. He said it was like history written in lightning. Inherit the Wind started out, as I mentioned, a play written by Jerome Lawrence, Robert E. Lee, back in 1955. But the most famous version we see nowadays is the screen version by Stanley Kramer in 1960. Spencer Tracy won an Academy Award for this. In fact, the film itself was beat out by one other film that year for the Academy Award, and that was Elmer Gantry. So it was a tough year for Christians that year in Hollywood. Harry Morgan, you probably remember from the old detective show, what was it, years ago, back in the 50s on TV? Dragnet, yeah, he was on Dragnet. And Frederick March played Brian in this movie. I showed this one time, and Ken Ham saw it, and he said, you know, your pictures from the movie look a lot like your historical pictures that were actually taken at the trial. So he said, you might just run a little red rim or something around or indicate what's fiction and what isn't. So the movie is fiction, and you will see that red rim and that disclaimer every time you see the movie. In the film, the proper names of the participants are not used. For example, William Jennings Bryan's name is not used, the famous lawyer who was for the prosecution. Instead, he's called Matthew Harrison Brady. Clarence Darrow is called Henry Drummond. John Scopes is Bert Cates. H.L. Mencken, kind of an ultra-liberal editorialist of his day, not unlike many editorialists today in our major newspapers. He worked for the Baltimore Sun. He's called E.K. Hornbeck. You'll notice that in each case, they use the same number of syllables for the word and construct the name the same way. But by not using the original names, then they feel that they can free themselves from all criticism as to the historical accuracy. Everybody knows who these various characters represent, so I will use the actual names: William Jennings Bryan, Clarence Darrow, John Scopes. Well, the movie begins with people, rather sinister-looking people, i.e. local politicians and the local clergy person, converging on the schoolhouse, and inside the schoolhouse, poor John Scopes, valiant, brave biology teacher, is trying to teach a class, and he will be pulled out of that classroom and thrown in jail. Notice the music is just precisely out of key.
That old-time religion, give me that old-time religion, it's good enough for me.
Well, what are the actual facts in the situation? It looks like it's going to be a witch hunt, right? That's the whole idea of the play and the movie, that innocent teacher is teaching and townsfolk come in to give him a lot of trouble. They are on a witch hunt. Sprague de Camp, in his book, The Great Monkey Trial, which sadly is out of print now, it was one of the really major books on the trial. In the book, he says the trial wasn't a witch hunt, as it's been called, because the accused and his defenders, the witches, were actually the hunters, stalking the law with the intent of overturning it, or at least making it unenforceable. So now you know what the Scopes trial was all about. It was an effort to make a law in the state of Tennessee and in other states unenforceable, to bring it into the courts and with a test trial undercut the law. Who was the organization then that was the witch or the hunter, and who was trying to get this trial rolling in the beginning? I'm not at liberty to tell you, so I'm just going to reveal the initials. The ACLU out of New York City was the organization that initially pursued bringing a state into the court or a teacher in a state to approach this whole issue. Now, the intriguing thing is there were actually 20 states back in 1925, which is the period of time we're talking about, that had passed a bill that essentially forbid teaching that man evolved from apes. These bills did not prohibit any other kind of evolution. You could teach the origin of life from non-life, the origin of vertebrates from invertebrates, the origin of birds from reptiles. All forms of evolution would have been permitted, but you couldn't teach, according to these bills, that man evolved from an ape or ape-like creature. And in the state of Tennessee, a certain John Washington Butler, who was a representative of the state there, he introduced one of the bills in Tennessee. As I say, they were all quite similar. In fact, most of these states had gotten together with William Jennings Bryan to discuss how to write the bill. And Bryan had urged them not to have any penalty, no fine, and no imprisonment, of course, for any teacher that violated the act, because that would make a martyr out of them. Well, many states went ahead and did put a fine on it, but nobody had a provision for imprisonment. Bryan had urged that teachers merely be given an opportunity to resign if they didn't want to follow the rules of the state. The Butler Act specifically said this, and as I say, very similar to at least 20 other states. It shall be unlawful for any teacher in any of the universities, normals, and all other public schools of the state which are supported in whole or in part by the public school funds of the state to teach any theory that denies the story of divine creation of man as taught in the Bible, and to teach instead that man has descended from a lower order of animals. So that is essentially the bill. And the movie and the play does get that part right. They pretty much read the Butler Act verbatim. Well, here's John Scopes, a young teacher, in the classroom teaching evolution, obviously a biology teacher here in the play and the film. Let's hear what he has to say to his class.
Good morning, young ladies and gentlemen.
There they are.
Good morning, visitors.
You're going to hear some real science now.
For our science lesson for today, we will continue our discussion of Darwin's theory of the descent of man. Now, as I told you yesterday, Darwin's theory tells us that man evolved from a lower order of animals. From the first wiggly protozoa here in the sea, to the ape, and finally, to man. Now, some of you fellows out there are probably going to say that's why some of us act like monkeys. But what Mr. Charles Darwin was trying to tell us in his own way...
Bertram T. Cates?
Come off it, Sam. You've known me all my life.
Bert, you're charged with violation of Public Act 31428, Volume 37, Statute Number 31428 of the State Code, which makes it unlawful for any teacher of the public schools to teach any theory that denies the creation of man as taught in the Bible, and to teach instead that man has descended from a lower order of animals. Bertram Cates, I hereby place you under arrest.
Teacher jailed in test of evolution law. What are the facts of the matter? As I mentioned, if you take all of the basic statements in the movie Inherit the Wind, and if you assume the opposite is true, you will be right most of the time. The facts are these. John Scopes certainly didn't know Sam his whole life because, well, John Scopes taught 1 year out of his entire life. Here's a picture of John Scopes at the time of the trial with his father. Scopes had graduated in what is essentially pre-law from the University of Kentucky. He did not have a significant scientific background. John Scopes taught 1 year out of his entire life, and that year was in the Ray County School District of Dayton, Tennessee. Scopes taught math. I understand he did teach a physics class as well. And most importantly, he coached the football team. Scopes was not disliked in Dayton, Tennessee. People thought well of him, and well they might. Nobody knows how he did in the math or physics class, but they had a good football team. Now, the closest John Scopes ever got to evolution, or even biology in general, was at the last 2 weeks of the school year, virtually at the end of Scopes' entire teaching career. A certain teacher by the name of Mr. Ferguson, who was the biology teacher, became ill. And John Scopes was invited to come into the class during those last 2 weeks while the students were preparing for their finals. And he basically helped to keep things down to a dull roar. You know how it goes during getting ready for finals. You basically keep them from tearing the place up. That's as close as he ever got to teaching biology, to say nothing of evolution, in his life. This is already a little different than what you have seen in the movie and play. At the time of the trial, he was interviewed by a news reporter from the International News Service, and he told this man, "There's something I must tell you. It's worried me. I didn't violate the law." Now, that's interesting. Here's a man worrying that he didn't violate a law. Usually it's the other way around, right, if you're going to be taken into the courts. Well, he was worried that he didn't violate the law. He said, "I never taught that evolution lesson. Those kids they put on the stand couldn't remember what I taught them 3 months ago. They were coached by the lawyers." Now, that's interesting. There's a name for this. I don't know too much about law, but if you actually coach your defendant to say something that is not true, that has a name. I think it's called perjury, is it not? Right. So these young kids who had not, in fact, been taught evolution by Scopes were told by the lawyers that they were, and were told essentially what to say. And John Scopes, in his own autobiography, said that he did not teach evolution. So it would appear that, for reasons we'll explore, the ACLU got the wrong man. They should have gotten somebody else to work with him on their test case, but they had to live with Scopes. And Scopes urged this reporter not to break the news to the media till after the trial. He says his lawyers would kill him. Think of it. If it were shown that he were completely innocent, that in fact he had not taught evolution, his defense lawyers would kill him. Isn't that an interesting thing? Now, it's figurative, but in other words, this was a test case that had nothing whatever to do with a teacher who had taught evolution. Now, how did he get himself into this fix? You know, this is a lesson for us. We need to watch before we get drawn into things. He had a friend, similar age, living in Dayton by the name of George Raplaya. George Raplaya was from New York, and he had married a woman there in Dayton whose family owned the Cumberland Iron and Coal Company. And Dayton's kind of off the beaten path. And Raplaya wanted to attract commercial interests in Dayton. And he thought he could do it by maybe getting a really big trial going that had national, possibly even international implications. And he got the idea from a newspaper. So here's his credentials: operated Cumberland Iron and Coal, and he hoped to promote economic interest in Dayton. And he was the man who talked his friend John Scopes into cooperating with the ACLU case. Where did Raplaya hear about this, and how did he get involved? Well, it seemed he had been visiting in a city nearby, Chattanooga, and in the Chattanooga Daily Times, he had read an ad from the American Civil Liberties Union that, among other things, said, "We are looking for a Tennessee teacher who is willing to accept our services in testing this law in the courts." So that's how everything began. Well, Scopes put up a little resistance. He said he really didn't want to get involved with this, but he was talked into it. And Raplaya immediately sent a telegram to the American Civil Liberties Union, and I kind of like this telegram. It's pretty interesting. Professor J.T. Scopes, teacher of science, Ray County High School, Dayton, Tennessee, will be arrested and charged with teaching evolution. Consent of Superintendent of Education for test case to be defended by you. Wire me collect if you wish to cooperate, and arrest will follow. Okay, so this isn't exactly the townfolk jumping on this poor teacher. Well, as you know, once you let yourself in for something you really shouldn't have let yourself in for, bad just goes to worse. The ACLU accepted their offer, and the lawyer that was hired to, or at least whose services were used to bring poor John Scopes under the control of the law was a man by the name of Sue Hicks, local lawyer of the family of Hicks and Hicks in Dayton. And you all know Sue Hicks. Yes, you do. You don't know Sue Hicks from because he prepared the arrest warrant for John Scopes. That would be pretty famous right there, wouldn't it? He was the man that wrote the arrest warrant after the ACLU said they would indeed cooperate and pay all expenses. Probably you don't even know him because he was a lawyer in the Dayton firm of Hicks and Hicks, and you probably don't know him because he was the one that arrested Scopes and then released him on a $1,000 bond, which Scopes never had to pay for. There were all kinds of vested interests here that were providing the money. And he's really quite famous because he was the one who asked William Jennings Bryan, who was a very, very famous speaker and orator of his time and a leader in the Democratic Party, very outspoken scripture and Bible student. He was the one that had asked Jennings Bryan to participate in the trial, which was guaranteed to make it famous. No, the reason you know Sue Hicks is this is the man that the Johnny Cash song, A Boy Named Sue, was based on. This is The Boy Named Sue. Okay, isn't that interesting how people make their names in this world? Well, here's where the troubles really began for poor John Scopes. They're sitting in Robertson's Ice Cream Parlor in Dayton. This is a picture of the real John Scopes at the time of the trial. He's sitting at a typical ice cream table of the time, no doubt sitting on those little harp-backed ice cream chairs. And he's looking at a book. And next to him are various other people in the town. This is one of the Hicks people, the lawyer. And this is his friend, Raplaya, back here. And he was talked into participating in the trial. Scopes had said, look, I didn't teach evolution. But Raplaya says, wait a minute, let's look at the textbook that they were using in this course. And it happened that they were using Hunter's Civic Biology, which is the very book that they're looking at on the table. And they discovered that the textbook taught evolution, so that's close enough. Now, there were a lot of groups that really were out to get evolution into the schools and vigorously supported books like Hunter's Civic Biology, including the National Council of Churches and other liberal theological groups. And you might like to see what sort of things were taught in the name of evolution in Hunter's Civic Biology. Well, from the very edition that Scopes used, we read the following. If we follow the history of man upon the earth, we find that at first he must have been little better than one of the lower animals. At the present time, there exists upon the earth 5 races or varieties of man. The highest type of all, the Caucasians, represented by the civilized white inhabitants of Europe and America. So that's the kind of stuff that was being vigorously defended by liberal theologians in this day and by scientists. The scientific content of Hunter's Civic Biology is really pretty abysmal. After Scopes had agreed to participate, he was whisked off to New York City. And here he is at the headquarters of the American Civil Liberties Union in New York City. He was 24 years old at the time. He's sitting right here at the table. Over here is Clarence Darrow, a very, very famous criminal lawyer, as we'll see. And so Clarence Darrow was pitted against William Jennings Bryan. This is like the 2 most famous lawyers in the world who are poles apart in terms of their religious views or lack thereof. And it was guaranteed to produce fireworks, and indeed it did. Darrow was well into his 70s at the time of the trial. In fact, this was the last case that he fought, the Scopes trial. In the movie, we see a stark difference between the portrayal of Brian and the portrayal of Darrow. Here's Brian, who remember is called Brady in the movie, and his entrance into Hillsboro, which is the name the movie gives to Dayton, Tennessee. Notice he's a very proud man, comes in very pompous. Well, you can see it's one proud man, and he's getting a really spectacular introduction to the city, and he's dressed to the nines, and everything is just wonderful, except, well, that isn't really the truth at all. This is a photograph of Brian arriving in Dayton, Tennessee, and Hicks is over here, and there are various other people there greeting him. He has his pith helmet. This was in July, and it was very hot that year in Dayton, Tennessee in July. Another thing that the film and the play kind of pokes at is they try to make Brian a very pompous man with an extremely tedious sense of humor. Listen to this.
Colonel Brady, I like the sound of that. Friends, Mrs. Brady and I are delighted to be among you.
We all voted for you 3 times.
I trust it was in 3 separate elections. I can only wish for one thing, that you're not giving us quite so warm a welcome.
The interesting thing is in the book and the play, they argue that this play does not occur in any time in history. It could be the past, it could be the future. But in the play, the bailiff in the court says that he had voted for Brian, and he gives the years when he had voted for Brian, and they're the very years that Brian ran. So the play and the movie is being completely ingenuous when they suggest that this is not an event, a specific event in history. What is the actual truth about Brian? What kind of man was he? Was he kind of a strutting, pompous? He's sort of portrayed as a glutton. He's constantly chewing on chicken and belching and what have you. Sprague de Camp was very much on the side of evolution. Certainly was not a creationist in any sense of the word, but in his book, this is what he had to say about Brian. As a speaker, Brian radiated good-humored sincerity. Few who heard him could help liking him. In personality, he was forceful, energetic, and opinionated, but genial, kindly, generous, likable, and charming. He showed a praiseworthy tolerance towards those who disagreed with him. Brian was the greatest American orator of his time, and perhaps any time. He had a voice that was very interesting. It was kind of a thin-pitched voice, and it could cut through sound in outdoor environments. Remember, they didn't have PA systems back then. They didn't wear 3 microphones like I have on right now. And he could be heard in a crowd even much bigger than this outside. This is a picture of Brian when he was a young man, and he would be famous for many reasons, even if he hadn't participated in the Scopes trial. He was a great American orator. As you've heard, he traveled the Chautauqua circuit. This was before TV. In fact, it was in the infancy of radio. And in many small towns, people were entertained by going out and hearing a speaker, much as you are today here. And these speakers used a form of English that you would not get away with today. They drew deeply from Greek mythology, from the Bible. It was a very, very sophisticated English that demanded a good background in history and in mythology and other areas. Someone try to give a lecture like that today for a general population, and I don't think it would go over so well. He was an outspoken Christian, ran a very, very large Bible class, and was well known for his Christian activities. He was a leader of the Democratic Party for 30 years, and he ran for president 3 times, and he never made it in any of the 3 runs, which is a little surprising given his immense popularity among the citizens. But a lot of people may not realize this, but a lot of the people that supported him as a Christian and as a person were sometimes disinclined to vote for him because politically, today we would call him a liberal. He was at least very progressive. And so a lot of people who appreciated him as a conservative would not, due to political differences, have necessarily voted for him. In fact, Clarence Darrow supported him in his first 2 runs for the presidency, and he was sort of the arch-liberal of his time. He did serve as Secretary of State under President Woodrow Wilson. This is a way he
I
sounded.
can conceive of a national destiny which meets the responsibilities of today and measures up to the possibilities of tomorrow. Behold a republic, resting securely upon the mountain of eternal truth. A republic applying in practice and proclaiming to the world the self-evident proposition that all men are created equal.
So you can see he had a very distinctive voice. Let's just look at some of this man's achievements. Most of us in this room, I suspect, will never rise to the level of really any of these. While he served as Secretary of State, he played a large role in the following things: the popular election of senators, the development of the federal income tax. Okay, folks, let's let bygones be bygones, shall we? The unlimited coinage of silver, the establishment of the Department of Labor, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, workmen's compensation, minimum wage, women's suffrage, minority rights. I guess either way works. The Pure Food and Drug Act, and he was a bit of a pacifist, actually, although he was a colonel in the United States Army, and he tried to prevent the outbreak of World War I. So, as you can see, for his time, a very progressive politician who had been involved in a great deal of very important legislation. How did the media portray William Jennings Bryan? Well, you can just about guess. Anyone that would champion the creation point of view is going to get the usual vilification in the media. Here in the Cleveland Plain Dealer, on the left, we see Bryan as a crusader sitting on a horse, marching through in the name of religion. This was another favorite portrayal. This one was in the Chicago Tribune. It shows Bryan as Don Quixote jousting with windmills, and of course the windmill is evolution, implying his futile efforts to stop the unstoppable. This cartoon shows you how vicious it could get even back then. We know it can get vicious today if you dare to doubt Darwinism. And it was no different back then. This is supposed to be Bryan standing on a cliff, dumping a garbage can full of documents over, and they are falling into the dark ages, as you can see. And what are these documents that he's trashing? The cartoon says rubbish, and the rubbish that he's trashing is the whole of agriculture, the law of gravity, mathematics, mechanics, animal husbandry, medicine, surgery, x-rays, steam, and navigation. That's for doubting Darwin. So let that be a lesson to you. You doubt Darwin at your own risk. It was true back in 1925. It's true today. Well, when Darrow comes into town, it's presumably a very different story. Very modest. He gets out of his little old bus, and wouldn't you know it, the first thing that happens is one of these Christians just runs right in front of him. Don't you hate it when they do that?
Hello, devil. Welcome to hell.
Hello, Hornbeck.
Hillsborough, Heavenly Hillsborough.
This is supposed to be H.L. Mencken, and it was certainly not cast very well in the movie. He's made out to be an altogether pleasant sort of guy, as indeed Darrow was. What do we know about Clarence Darrow? Well, he was also a very famous man and certainly an able opponent for William Jennings Bryan. He was arguably America's most famous criminal lawyer ever. That includes to this very day. He was an agnostic, essentially an atheist, but he preferred the word agnostic, which sounded like he was still open to evidence for the existence of God in the unlikely event anyone anywhere to ever be brought forward. He was an outspoken critic of what he called fundamentalism. He was strongly opposed to the death penalty, In fact, he worked very, very vigorously to save Leopold and Loeb from the death penalty. You may have heard about that. That was the case just before the Scopes trial. Two young men, 15 years old or so, brilliant young men, already in major universities, I think Johns Hopkins, I forget the other university. And they were sons of very, very wealthy people, one in the Sears and Roebuck fortune, another one had some big box manufacturing company. And because they indeed were very brilliant young men, they were very much influenced by the writings of Nietzsche that they had learned in school and college. And they thought that they themselves could be this Übermensch of whom Nietzsche wrote. Well, that's intriguing. A couple of Jewish young boys wanting to be Nietzsche's Übermensch. Hitler had ideas of his own in that area, didn't he? And so they thought they could commit the perfect crime. And so they went out and killed actually a relative of theirs, and then called the father after they killed him and extracted money out of him to return the young boy back safely, who they had already killed. Knowing that they had committed the perfect crime, they were certain they would never be caught. This wasn't quite the case. They were caught the next day. And the reason they were caught is that one of the boys had left his glasses behind where they had stuffed the young boy in a culvert after killing him. And because of their affluence, these glasses were very unusual. And they were able to trace them to the owner rather quickly. So he had just defended them. It was certainly a profitable case to defend, and he did in fact succeed in keeping them from getting the death penalty. Back at this time, we were just beginning to understand hormones and other chemicals that have an effect on human behavior. And Darrow believed that hormones like adrenaline and what have you proved that any aggressive tendencies of man had nothing to do with his own choices, but were just simply what chemistry does in the human body. And so it was inappropriate, in his view, to punish people for doing things that just chemically happen. Not only that, but he argued in the Scopes trial that, or he argued in the Leopold and Loeb trial, that you can't hold these young men accountable because they are responding to ideas they learned in school. Now, isn't that interesting? So Darrow, when he was in the Scopes trial, had to face Bryan, and Bryan says, look, the way you argued in Leopold and Loeb, you said that what we teach in school has a profound effect on young people and how they behave. Well, that was his whole point. Evolution can have a similar effect. Darrow defended a lot of unpopular people and radical causes, and as I've said, his last two cases were Leopold and Loeb in the Scopes trial. Well, what did the media think of Darrow? He had much better treatment than Bryan. This will come as no surprise. For example, on your left, you see Darrow standing here shaking his finger at little Bryan, who's crying, and he's telling him, there ain't no Santa Claus. And, of course, that came as a huge shock to Bryan here. In other words, a very naive person dealing with a very hip, sophisticated Darrow. Sometimes the media played up the theme of a monkey looking at Darrow. Basically, here he's saying Papa, so they did a lot of joking around about the whole idea of monkeys being relatives of humans. The movie and the play begin to really get a little vicious in this scene here. Scopes is in jail. This group is getting together outside. They're burning Scopes in effigy, want him killed, and from bad it goes to worse. And I want you to listen to the hymn. Remember, this takes place in the good old South, right up in the Cumberland Mountains in Dayton, Tennessee. Listen to the song they're singing, or at least the music.
We'll hang birthdays through a sour apple tree. Our God is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on. We'll hang birthdays through a sour apple tree. We'll hang birthdays through a sour apple tree.
Yes, these good Southern folks are indeed singing the Northern Battle Hymn of the Republic. I mean, can't Hollywood get anything right? What is the truth of the matter? Of course, Scopes was not jailed. As far as I know, was never jailed in his life, and he was well liked by the citizens of Dayton, Tennessee. But the movie and the play both reserve their real contempt for Christians in general. This is the scene that every child whose paper was submitted to the teacher sitting next to me, at least every paper I saw, essay, talked about this scene. The Reverend Jeremiah Brown. Now, there was no Reverend Jeremiah Brown. There was no clergyman who even could be represented by the Reverend Jeremiah Brown. There were many churches in Dayton, Tennessee. Now, this is Hollywood's portrayal of Christianity. Imagine a public school class sitting down, listening to this one. It's an outdoor sort of tent meeting sort of thing, except there's no tent. They're outside. Brian and his wife are here listening. And this is the standard of Christianity a la Hollywood.
Yes.
Do we believe the Word?
Yes.
Do we believe the truth of the Word?
Yes.
Do we curse the man who denies the Word?
Yes.
Do we call down hellfire on the man who has sinned against the Word?
Yes.
Whatever happened to silent prayer?
O Lord of the tempest and the thunder, strike down this sinner, as thou did thine enemies of old in the days of the Pharaohs. Let him know the terror of thy sword. Let his soul for all eternity writhe in anguish and damnation.
No! No, Paul! Don't pray to destroy Bert!
Lord, we ask the same curse for those who ask grace for this sinner, though they be blood of my blood and flesh of my flesh. Reverend Brown, Reverend Brown. I know it's the Great Seal.
Now think of this. Imagine that in a public school classroom. And it really had impact on the students. This is what their essays were about. Every one I saw go across the page had Reverend Jeremiah Brown. You know, it seems nowadays you can persecute Christians all you want. You can ridicule them, you can demean them in the public school classroom, but almost no other group. Not American Indians, not blacks, not Islamics. And I'm not suggesting we do that either, obviously. But Christians can be singled out and treated. Imagine a movie like this dealing with almost any other group of people. It wouldn't be allowed in the classroom, whether it's considered a classic or not, and it's hardly really classic theater. What is the truth here? Well, there was no Jeremiah Brown. Scopes did not have a steady girlfriend at the time. He was only around for a year. Things didn't move that fast in those days. In the transcript trial, it has the entire trial, including the jury selection, as a transcript. It only took 4 days to select and place the jury and 8 days for the complete trial. Can you imagine that compared to today's jurisprudence and how slowly things go? But in the trial transcript, Darrow is commenting on how he had been treated by the people of Dayton, Tennessee, these Christian folks that you've just seen vilified in the play. He said, and I quote for the trial transcript, "I don't know as I was ever in a community in my life where my religious ideas differed as widely from the great mass as I have found them since I've been in Tennessee. Yet I came here a perfect stranger, and I can say what I've said before, that I have not found upon anybody's part, any citizen here in this town or outside, the slightest discourtesy. I have been treated better, kindlier, and more hospitably than I fancied would have been the case in the North." How about bringing that into the classroom to show the students after they've seen the play? Rather different understanding of the whole play. Well, you can still visit the Ray County Courthouse to this day. A beautiful building that's been just magnificently restored and preserved. There's a museum down in the basement down there, and you can go through the whole building. There's a railroad track back here about a block away. And if you spend much time in the building, you'll hear the train rumble by, and indeed the train rumbled by during the Scopes trial. You can see in the transcript they had to stop every once in a while until the train got past. If you look at the building on the inside, it too has been restored. The old metal ceilings are up here, and pretty much the same old windows and the chairs, the railing, everything very much as it was at the time of the trial. In fact, let's just morph this picture into a picture taken in 1925, and you'll see the interior is indeed very, very similar. They just don't have the old pot-belly stoves in there anymore. And that room was filled to the max in 100 degree or 90 to 100 degree temperature back in 1925. You can see the crowd here gathered for the trial. Newsmen came from all over the world. In fact, this was the first trial to be broadcast on the transatlantic cable, which had just been laid, and radio was just in its infancy. It was certainly one of the first trials to be broadcast on the radio. So the proceedings of this trial, as indeed the American Civil Liberties Union had anticipated, were to impact on the whole of America and Europe. Everybody would be hearing about this trial, which juxtaposed two very, very famous lawyers with very different points of view over the issue of creation and evolution in the public schools. The same battle is being fought today. In fact, a lot of the arguments are very similar. This is a kind of a famous picture of Bryan on the right and Darrow on the left. You see the fan to keep warm, and today, of course, you wouldn't dare have a cigarette in the hands of Darrow. That would be a no-no, but back then it still wasn't considered all that evil. These two gentlemen were elderly, both at the end of their career, and the legal question in the trial, and this was technically the only legal question that could be addressed in the trial, is the following. Did John Scopes violate the Butler Act by teaching that man has descended from a lower order of animals? Both the prosecution and the defense knew he hadn't taught this. Scopes knew he hadn't taught it, and both sides agreed to keep it under their hat because it had nothing to do with Scopes teaching evolution in the school. It had to do with a test case that was to test laws like the Butler Act. Okay, things get even more interesting. There's no trial like this in the whole history of American jurisprudence. Bryan spelled out what his objectives were in the trial. What, in fact, did he hope to accomplish? In his own memoirs that were completed by his wife after his death, he said his first objective was to establish the right of taxpayers to control what is taught in their schools. That sound familiar? See how few things have changed over the years? He said his second objective was to draw a line between teaching of evolution as a fact and teaching it as a theory. He was not for throwing evolution out of the schools. Back then, evolution didn't really get mentioned much in the schools, and evolutionists were trying to get it in the school. Creation was on the inside. Evolution was on the outside looking in. So see how different things are back then than they are today? Today, evolution's on the inside and creation's on the outside looking in. But the tables were just turned at this time. And the third, and notice here, Bryan didn't suggest that evolution not be taught. He just wanted the schools to discriminate between fact and speculation. He calls it a theory. I would change that to speculation. But nonetheless, he just wanted the students to understand when the teacher was saying something that was a demonstrable scientific fact versus when it was something of a more speculative nature. And his third objective was to see that teachers proven guilty of this offense should be given an opportunity to resign and not fined or jailed. What was Darrow's objective? In Darrow's own autobiography called The Story of My Life, Darrow said he only had one objective. He says, my object and my only object was to focus the attention of the country on the program of Mr. Bryan and the other fundamentalists in America. So he saw as his object somehow crushing fundamentalism. And he saw a significant component of that was to bring evolution into the schools, and that would be then the demise of what he referred to as fundamentalism or Christian fundamentalists. What was the media view of the trial? How was the trial itself portrayed? Here's a couple of typical examples. Here's a poor school teacher here with mortarboard and everything, hanging up in the tree, getting his coattails chewed out by dogs, and this dog is an anti-this law, and that dog is an anti-that law. And the state legislature back here is saying sick 'em. So in other words, teachers were really getting beat up by a bunch of laws. The picture on your right probably gets a little closer to how a lot of people felt about the trial in the media. Here's a teacher whose arms are all tied together so he can't move. He has a muzzle over his mouth. He has coverings over his ears, and he has black lenses on his glasses so he can't see, and he's pointing to a chart that shows a flat Earth. And that was in the New York World, and it raises the whole issue which you hear to this day, that anyone who dares to doubt Darwinism is essentially a member of the Flat Earth Society. I have been called a member of the Flat Earth Society so many times I have actually tried to get in touch with them. I figure if they're going to call me a member of the Flat Earth Society and there's nothing I can do to stop it, I've tried, I just might as well make contact and say, folks, I've arrived, I'm here. And I got on the internet and I have done a very thorough search for the Flat Earth Society. At first I was very excited. My browser that I use that has a search engine in it came up with about 30 or 40 hits for the Flat Earth Society. I thought, hey, the evolutionists are right. I'd never heard there was such a society before. And they say there is. I never met a creationist who had ever known anything about the Flat Earth Society. The only people that ever mention the Flat Earth Society are evolutionists. So here are all these hits, and I started reading. You know what it is? The Flat Earth Society is a rock group. And these are little fan clubs for this rock group. Boy. If that's what the Flat Earth Society is, I don't think I'm going to join. I'm not much into rock. So that argument still goes to this day. By the way, as far as I know, there is not a single legitimate organization that I know of that has anything whatever to do with the Flat Earth Society, although there is one website where somebody's clearly having some fun. They overdo it a bit. If they were a little more subtle, they might fool you, but they're not subtle. It's somebody just lampooning what they think would be ignorant Christians by having something on the net that you can send money in and get a diploma or whatever. This is the jury in the trial. Notice all men, no women played a role in the trial as nearly as I can tell. This is Judge Ralston over here on the side and the gentleman of the jury. They met outside to have their picture taken. This is the way Brian looked when he was addressing the court. Notice this microphone down here. That's the kind that's got the radial springs to keep it from vibrating and transmitting sound. And the microphone stand appears to be a 2x4. So we've come quite a ways in terms of sound since then. This is Darrow talking to the jury. Darrow is portrayed as a really altogether nice, friendly sort of guy. In fact, he was so hostile to the jury and the judge, having repeatedly insulted the judge, he was cited for contempt of court in the trial. And he came back the next day to ask forgiveness of the judge. And the judge said something that if a judge were to say this today, they would put him in jail and throw the key away. He said, just as my Lord and Savior has forgiven me for all of my trespasses, so I forgive you. And can you imagine a judge saying that today? So he was forgiven, and everything was back to the basics. During the trial, Brian is repeatedly shown to be a virtual know-nothing and proud of it. Look at this one here.
You in neatly between Numbers and Deuteronomy. Am I, my friends? Your Honor. The witness, my followers, ladies and gentlemen, the witnesses
Oh, you know what I stand for. What I believe. I believe in the truth of the book of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel.
Court is adjourned until 10 o'clock tomorrow morning.
Everybody is shocked. His poor wife comes up. This is his wife.
Nat, dear, let's go home.
Now, this is just amazing. In the play and the movie, they actually have a scene between Brian's wife and Darrow in which she is clearly lamenting that she didn't get to know Darrow a little better in their youth instead of this guy she got stuck with. I mean, the underhanded nature of this play is just unreal. But this is the way they portray a creationist. This is your evidence. You recite the names of the books of the Bible. This is one of my favorite clips in the trial. Listen to this one. This is what I call a real taste of irony.
Each man is a free agent. Then what is Bertram Cates doing in the Hillsborough jail? Supposing Mr. Cates had the influence and the lung power to railroad through the state legislature a law saying that only Darwin could be taught in the schools.
Ridiculous. Ridiculous. There is only one great truth in the world.
Think of that. They permitted themselves to actually make that statement, which, of course, is ridiculous, because today that's precisely the case, isn't it? Only Darwinism can be taught in terms of origin in the public school. So how things have changed, and yet they had the chutzpah to actually include that in the play. The interesting thing is that both Darrow and John Scopes at the time opposed teaching only one view of origins in the school. Darrow has been quoted as saying that it is bigotry for public schools to teach only one theory of origins. And Scopes, who said nothing during the whole trial, was never called to the witness stand, was given something to read that was prepared by the lawyers, and in it Scopes says, if you limit a teacher to only one side of anything, the whole country will eventually have only one thought and be one individual. Isn't that interesting? Well, you find out that Bryan knows nothing about Darwinism, nothing at all.
I don't suppose there are many portions of this book you've committed to memory. The Origin of the Species.
I am not the least interested in the pagan hypotheses of that book.
Never read it?
And I never will.
Now that's intriguing, because Bryan was a member of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He carried on a regular correspondence with many scientists of his time, including Henry Fairfield Osborn, who was a well-known evolutionist. He was very charitable in his discussions with these people and debated the evidence for and against evolution. He had read Darwin's Origin of Species in its entirety 25 years before the trial, and had a rather good understanding, as many of you would here, if not all of you today, being interested in the creation issue, a pretty good understanding of the evidence both for evolution and creation and the evidence against. And here he's portrayed as knowing nothing about Darwinism at all, just simply arguing against something he knew nothing about. In fact, the interesting thing is it wasn't Darrow that introduced Darwin's book into the trial. It was actually Bryan, not Darrow, who submitted Darwin's Descent of Man, not Origin of Species. And the reason that he submitted this book as evidence, the defense had tried to argue that Darwin never taught that man evolved from monkeys. But as I showed you in the quote last night, Darwin did say that man evolved from old world monkeys. So this is, again, a complete misrepresentation of the facts. This is another of the lawyers. In fact, this whole group here represent lawyers for the defense. There's Scopes down here, and this is Bryan here. And it's interesting to look at some of the arguments they presented. Now, one of the key points of evolution that sort of was danced around a bit in the trial is that evolution is where all life comes from one cell, some primordial cell. What the defense did, and this is very clever, I would say devilishly clever, they substituted embryology in for evolution. So all life comes from one cell, right? The fertilized egg. And by swapping in the fertilized egg as the life that life comes from, they could sort of dance around and substitute embryology for evolution. Now, I know what you're thinking. Surely it wasn't that bad, was it? Let's just look and see what happens here. Judge Ralston, who you see here on the left, was getting a little confused by what he was hearing. And so he asked Clarence Darrow whether he was saying that all life on Earth came from some primitive original cell. Look at this answer that Darrow gives. Well, I'm not quite so clear, but I think it did. All human life comes from one cell. You came from one, and I came from one. Nothing else, a single cell. Isn't that clever? You think, well, Darrow was clever that way. None of the other lawyers would do anything like that. Well, let's look at another lawyer. This is Arthur Garfield Hayes, another lawyer for the defense. What did he say in the courtroom? He says, I know that in the womb of the mother, the very first thing is a cell, and that cell grows and it subdivides and it grows into a human being, and a human being is born. Does that statement, as the boy stated on the stand, that he was taught that man comes from a cell, is that a theory that man descended from a lower order of animals? I don't know, and I dare say Your Honor has some doubt about it. Are we entitled to find out whether it is or not in presenting this case? So you see, embryology, the development in the womb, is substituted in for evolution. In fact, the jury was told that if we don't teach evolution, physicians will know nothing about how the baby develops in the womb, and this will be very bad. You think, well, okay, a couple of the lawyers got a little confused. Well, it wasn't just a couple of the lawyers. Dudley Field Malone, a Roman Catholic who specialized in divorce court cases, subsequently became a movie star after this time. This is what he said. The embryo becomes a human being when it's born. Not until, by the way. Evolution never stops from the beginning of the one cell until the human being returns in death to lifeless dust. We wish to set before you evidence of this character in order to stress the importance of the theory of evolution. You think, well, what do lawyers know, right? I mean, they get confused about these things. Intentionally or unintentionally, but we know that there were scientists who were there who were professional evolutionists, and they certainly wouldn't get confused on this issue, would they? In fact, here are the scientists, as well as a couple of lawyers, who were assembled as expert witnesses at the trial. Now, it turns out they never testified beyond one of them, who I will quote, and the reason they didn't testify is the issue wasn't whether evolution was true or not, it was just, did Scopes teach it or not? And so the defense said, we really don't have to, or the prosecution said, we're not here to prove whether evolution is true or not. But Bryan finally gave in and he says, okay, I propose that you bring your experts in and that the scientists tell us about evolution. The only thing I ask is that we can cross-examine them. Darrow was so opposed to having his scientists cross-examined that Darrow never called them to the stand, even when he had been given the approval to do so. That's a little different than what you see. And if you want to see what what Darrow was worried about, let's look at the testimony of one scientist who did testify. This is Dr. Maynard Metcalf of Johns Hopkins University. He was asked by the judge to define what he meant by this statement, the fact of evolution. Here it is, my friends. The fact of evolution. In the transcript, it's all one sentence. I'm sorry, before that, he gives his credentials. He says, I have always been particularly interested in the evolution of the individual organism from the egg. Think of it. The evolution from the egg. The judge is really confused, so he asks him, would you tell us what you mean by the fact of evolution? And this is all one sentence, and I'll do my best to get it out. Evolution, I think, means the change in the final analysis. I think it means the change of an organism from one character into a different character, and by character I mean its structure, or its behavior, or its function, or its method of development from the egg or anything else. The change of an organism from one set characteristic which characterizes it into a different condition characterized by a different set of characteristics, either structural or functional, could be properly called, I think, evolution, to be the evolution of that organism. But the term in general means the whole series of such changes which have taken place during hundreds of millions of years, which have produced from lowly beginnings, the nature of which is not by any means fully understood, to organism of much more complex character whose structure and function we are still studying because we haven't begun to learn what we need to know about them. That is the fact of evolution presented by a Johns Hopkins professor to the trial. No wonder they didn't want them cross-examined. Well, the last day of the trial, it was hot. They moved outside, and Bryan, I suspect because of maybe his own sense of ego or whatever, allowed himself, this is incredible that any lawyer would do this, allowed himself to take the witness stand to testify as an expert on the Bible. Now, to be fair, Bryan said, look, I'll do this if you, Darrow, will take the witness stand the next day, and I'll cross-examine you on atheism and agnosticism. So they agree. So Bryan gets the first turn up. Darrow asked him a lot of questions. He even asked him whether he truly believed that Jonah had swallowed the whale. By and large, Bryan did a pretty decent job of answering the question, showed a good grasp of Scripture. Of course, Darrow was outraged that anyone could believe any of this. Everything was going well, I thought, until you get to the point, and Darrow obviously set Bryan up for this, about the days of creation. Now here, I hope you will learn a lesson to take home with you. Darrow asks, do you think the earth was made in 6 days? Bryan says, not in 6 days of 24 hours. Darrow says, doesn't it say so? Bryan says, no, sir. You can see he's getting in trouble. Darrow then says, and this is just sad, every time I read this, it almost brings tears. Does the statement, the morning and evening were the first day and the morning and evening were the second day, mean anything to you? That's being put on the hot spot, for Darrow, or for Bryan. Bryan says, I do not see that there is any necessity for constructing the words the evening and the morning as meaning necessarily a 24-hour day. Darrow's clever. He comes back with, so, the creation might have been going on for a very long time. And Bryan just jumps in the whole way now. It might have continued for millions of years. When Bryan said that, Darrow was done. Darrow came in the next morning and asked the judge to instruct the jury to find his own client that he was defending guilty as charged. I don't think this has ever happened in American jurisprudence. And why was he in such a hurry? Remember, that's the day he was supposed to take the witness stand, right? And he never did, because the trial came to a sudden end when the defense lawyer asked that his own client be found guilty as charged. Well, the whole thing came tumbling to a close. Scopes was found guilty.
Bertram Cates, this court has found you guilty of violating Public Act Volume 37, Statute 31428 as charged. This violation is punishable by fine and or imprisonment.
Which is not true.
But since there has been no previous violation of this statute, there's no precedent to guide the bench passing sentence. The court deems it proper to sentence Bertram Cates to pay a fine of $100.
Did Your Honor say $100?
That is correct. That seems to conclude the business of the trial.
But, Your Honor, the prosecution takes exception. Why, the issues are so titanic, the court must mete out more drastic punishment.
Isn't this ironic? Here's the man that had urged everybody not to have any fine at all in all 20 states. He had offered to personally pay the fine for Scopes. And in the play and the movie, he is shown as being very vindictive and regretting that the punishment wasn't far more draconian when he was the fellow that had cautioned. I mean, nothing is portrayed accurately in this play or movie. The opposite is the truth in almost every case. Well, Scopes was found guilty. This is an actual picture at the time of the trial. The whole case was reversed subsequent to this because of a technicality, and so he wasn't even fined the $100. And the Butler law was overturned in the 60s in Tennessee versus Epperson. And today, Tennessee is no different than any other state in having evolution be sort of the exclusive domain of the public school. Well, in the movie, we see Bryan tries to give his closing argument. Neither side, in fact, gave a closing argument because the defense conceded the guilt of their client. So there were no closing arguments. But in the movie, you have Bryan trying to give it. He goes crazy, becomes completely unglued, and in a heat of insane religious fervor, keels over and dies on the courtroom floor. This is a picture of Bryan taken 5 days after the trial. He died that day that this picture was taken. He died from complications from a long-standing case of diabetes, which in those days was not treated very well. And he had had a very vigorous activity up to this point. He had been nearly killed by being brushed by a car. He had traveled several hundred miles over country roads, giving lectures here and there. He had gone up into the hills around Dayton to help select the site for building Bryan College, and he died in his sleep Sunday, July 26th. Now, what kind of price do you pay for daring to criticize Darwinism or limit its spread in the public schools? I want you to read this obituary written by H.L. Mencken, who was an editorialist of his time from the Baltimore Sun. This is what H.L. Mencken said about William Jennings Bryan. Bryan was deluded by a childish theology full of almost a pathological hatred of all learning, all human dignity, all beauty, all fine and noble things. Imagine a gentleman, and you have imagined everything that he was not. That's the price you pay. Even for compromising sometimes, but that's the price you pay for taking a position on such a thing. Well, if you're interested in this trial, as I say, you can pick up the transcript. I saw some books at a table out there, and we have the books over here from AIG. And there's also a smaller book written by a man named John Cornelius from Bryan College. On the internet, you can look up scopestrial.net, and there you will be able to see most of the transcript on at least the first 4 or 5 days on the web, and pick up a lot of articles on the Scopes trial, including one that I have written, and I thank you very kindly.